Cold rain lashed against the diner windows. A cheap paper cup sat between swollen hands. She was exhausted, her back aching from endless shifts. Then, a familiar voice cut through the background hum. Derek, her former fiancé, looking as polished and smug as ever. He leaned over her table, eyes dragging across her oversized sweater. He smirked. "Wow, Chloe, you really let yourself go. You got fat." He had no idea the child growing inside her belonged to the city's most dangerous man. The neon sign of the diner flickered, casting a sickly pink hue over the wet pavement outside. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old frying grease, stale coffee, and damp wool. Chloe sat in a corner booth. The vinyl seat was cracked, poking sharp edges into her thighs. She shifted, trying to find a position that didn't put pressure on her lower back. It was a useless effort. At 6 months pregnant, comfort was a distant, abstract concept. She stared down at the black coffee she shouldn't be drinking. Decaf, the waitress had promised. But Chloe knew it was just the bottom of whatever pot had been sitting on the burner since 3 o'clock. She wrapped her hands around the ceramic mug anyway, letting the heat seep into her perpetually cold fingers. The bell above the diner door jingled. A blast of freezing November air swept through the narrow room, carrying with it the loud, braying laugh of a man who thought he owned whatever space he occupied. Chloe didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the swirling, dark liquid in her cup. But her shoulders tensed. You never really forget the sound of a voice that spent 3 years telling you that you weren't quite good enough. "I'm telling you, the market is completely soft right now," the voice said, moving closer. "I told the board, either we restructure the assets or we bleed out by Q3. Derek. Chloe slouched down, pulling the lapels of her oversized thrift store trench coat closer together. She was wearing a baggy grey sweater underneath, hoping the layers would disguise the undeniable, rounded swell of her stomach. She just wanted him to get his coffee and leave. She didn't have the energy for this. Her ankles were swollen over the tops of her cheap boots, her head was pounding, and she hadn't slept a full night in 2 months. "Oh, look who it is." The words dropped like loose change on a tile floor, loud, cheap, and irritating. Chloe slowly lifted her head. Derek stood at the edge of her booth. He looked exactly the same. His hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, despite the wind outside. He wore a tailored navy overcoat that probably cost more than Chloe made in 3 months at the dry cleaners. Hanging off his arm was a woman who looked like she stepped out of a catalogue for expensive ski resorts. She was tall, blonde, and looking at Chloe with a mixture of confusion and mild disgust. "Derek," Chloe said. Her voice was flat. She didn't offer a smile. "Chloe." "Wow." Derek didn't move on. He stepped closer, invading her space. His eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of her body, taking in the tired bags under her eyes, the lack of makeup, the messy bun hastily pinned to the top of her head, and finally, the heavy, bulked-up shape of her under the coat. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. "It's been, what? 8 months since you moved out?" Derek chuckled, turning slightly to the blonde on his arm as if including her in an inside joke. "I see you've been handling the breakup well. Abandoned the gym membership, did we?" Chloe stared at him. The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking, yet entirely unsurprising. This was the Derek she knew. Petty. Vain. Always needing to prove he was the winner. When he left her 8 months ago, after she caught him sleeping with his junior analyst, he had framed it as a necessary step for his career. She was holding him back. She was too ordinary. "I'm just tired, Derek," Chloe said softly. "Long day." "I can tell," he said, leaning in. The smell of his expensive cologne, something sharp and citrusy, made Chloe's stomach roll. The baby kicked, a sudden sharp jab against her ribs, as if sharing her annoyance. "I mean this as a friend, Chloe. Seriously, you really let yourself go. You got fat." The blonde woman giggled, pressing her manicured hand against her mouth. "Derek, stop, you're awful." "What? I'm just being honest. She knows I value fitness." He looked back at Chloe, eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "Take care of yourself, Chloe. Maybe try a salad." He turned on his heel, guiding his new prize toward the counter to order. Chloe didn't cry. A year ago, she might have. A year ago, Derek's approval had been the barometer for her self-worth. Now, sitting in the drafty diner, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thumping of another heartbeat inside her, she felt nothing but a cold, detached pity for him. He thought she was fat. He thought she was a depressed, abandoned ex-girlfriend eating her feelings in a cheap diner. He didn't know. He didn't know that beneath the heavy wool and the baggy cotton, she was carrying a child. And he certainly didn't know that the father of this child was a man whose mere name would make Derek drop to his custom-tailored knees and beg for his life. Chloe rested a hand on her stomach, under the table, out of sight. Just ignore him, she thought, rubbing a soothing circle over the taut skin. He's a nobody. She stood up, leaving a crumpled $5 bill on the table. She didn't look at Derek as she walked out the door, stepping back into the freezing rain. She had to get to her second job. The rent was due in 3 days, and Leo Costa's son was not going to be born on the streets if she could help it. The walk from the diner to the subway station was a miserable 4 blocks. The wind whipped down the concrete canyons of the city, biting through Chloe's coat. She walked slowly, her center of gravity shifted forward, her lower back screaming in protest with every step on the uneven pavement. As she descended the concrete stairs into the subway, the smell of ozone and damp garbage rushed to greet her. She swiped her worn card, pushed through the heavy turnstile, and found a spot against a grimy tiled pillar to wait for the downtown train. She closed her eyes, listening to the distant rumble of the tracks. Leo. His name always surfaced when she was tired. It was a ghost that haunted her waking hours and dominated her dreams. She hadn't planned on falling into bed with a mobster. Nobody ever plans that. It wasn't like the movies. There were no grand declarations, no immediate shootouts, no glamorous balls. She had been working as a bartender at a high-end hotel downtown, trying to scrape together enough money to move out of the apartment she still shared with Derek after the breakup. Leo Costa had come in on a quiet Tuesday night. He wasn't flashy. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit. But he didn't wear jewelry. No rings, no gold chains. Just a man with dark, assessing eyes and a jawline that looked like it had been chiseled out of granite. He ordered a neat whiskey and drank it in silence. He came back the next night. And the next, they started talking. Small things at first. The weather. The terrible jazz music the hotel manager insisted on playing. Chloe found herself looking forward to his visits. He listened to her. Truly listened, with a quiet intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. After Derek's constant self-aggrandizing chatter, Leo's grounded, heavy silence was a drug. Then came the night she got off shift late. It was raining. He offered her a ride. She knew it was a bad idea. She knew he was dangerous. You didn't have to be a criminal mastermind to recognize the signs. The deference the hotel staff showed him. The way 2 heavily built men always sat at a table near the door when he was at the bar. The quiet, lethal grace in the way he moved. But she was lonely. And she was angry at the world. and when he looked at her in the dim light of his car, she didn't want to go home to her empty, cold life. It lasted 3 months. 3 months of stolen hours in expensive hotel rooms, of whispered conversations in the dark, of a physical connection so intense it terrified her. Leo was fiercely protective, unexpectedly tender, and completely consumed by her. But the reality of his world couldn't stay outside the bedroom door forever. It happened on a Thursday. She was waiting for him at a restaurant. A man sat down across from her, a man she didn't know, with a jagged scar across his neck. He didn't threaten her directly. He just smiled, slid a photograph of her mother's house across the table and said, "Tell Costa his time is up, and tell him he has terrible taste in collateral." Chloe didn't wait for Leo. She walked out the back door of the restaurant, went to her apartment, packed a single duffel bag, and got on a bus. She knew Leo would look for her, but she also knew that if she stayed, she would be used as a pawn to hurt him, or worse, she would end up dead. She thought she was doing the right thing. She thought she was saving them both. 2 weeks later, throwing up in the bathroom of a cheap motel in a neighboring state, she realized just how complicated things had become. The rumble of the subway train pulled Chloe back to the present. The doors slid open and she shuffled inside, grabbing a metal pole for support. The train lurched forward, swaying violently. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the train window. Her face was fuller, her eyes deeply shadowed. Derek was right about one thing. She had changed, but not in the way he thought. She wasn't fat. She was a fortress. She was keeping a secret that could tear the city's underworld apart. The Costa family was ruthless, traditional, and deeply paranoid. If Leo's enemies found out she was carrying his heir, the child would be a target before it even took its first breath. If Leo found out, she didn't know what he would do. Would he be furious she ran? Would he take the baby and lock her out? He was a man who controlled everything in his orbit. She had taken away his control. She rubbed her belly again. The baby shifted, pressing a tiny foot against her side. "Just you and me, kid," she whispered to the empty train car. "We're going to be fine." She had a job keeping books for a small, legitimate auto shop on the edge of town. It paid cash. No questions asked. She had a tiny, drafty apartment under a fake name. It was a miserable existence, but it was safe. At least she thought it was safe. 3 days later, the heating in Chloe's apartment finally gave out. The landlord, a miserable man who smelled perpetually of cheap cigars, refused to answer her calls. By noon, she could see her own breath in the living room. Defeated and freezing, she decided to spend her Saturday afternoon at the large public library downtown. It was warm, it was free, and she could get some reading done on infant care. She bundled up in her heavy coat and took the bus. The library was a massive, modern glass building, bustling with students and families. Chloe found a quiet corner on the 3rd floor, near the sociology section, and settled into a worn armchair. The heat blowing from the ceiling vents was heavenly. For the first time in days, her muscles actually relaxed. She was an hour into a book about sleep training when she heard the voices. "I'm just saying, the tax write-off alone makes the charity gala worth attending. Plus, the mayor is going to be there." Chloe froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She slowly lowered the book and peeked through the gap in the bookshelves. Derek. He was standing near the grand staircase, talking loudly into his cell phone, pacing back and forth. He was in his element, wearing a sharp grey suit, gesturing wildly with his free hand. Chloe shrank back into her chair, holding her breath. "Just walk away, Derek. Keep walking." But fate, it seemed, had a sick sense of humour. Derek turned, his eyes scanning the quiet reading area. His gaze swept past the armchairs, paused, and then snapped back. He lowered his phone. A wide, predatory smile broke across his face. He ended his call and strutted over, his hard leather shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood floor, ignoring the dirty looks from a nearby librarian. Well, if it isn't my favorite charity case, Derek said, his voice carrying too far in the quiet space. Chloe sighed, closing her book. Derek, do you actively track me down, or is this just terrible luck? I work 2 blocks from here, Chloe. I was just cutting through to get to the parking garage. He leaned against the bookshelf, crossing his arms. He looked her up and down again. Without the bulky sweater from the diner, wearing just a long-sleeved maternity shirt under her open coat, the shape of her body was slightly more pronounced. But to a man like Derek, who only saw what he wanted to see, she just looked heavier. You know, I was thinking about our little run-in at the diner, Derek said, his tone dripping with condescension. And I actually felt bad for you. I really did. I don't need your pity, Derek. Please leave me alone. No, listen. I'm being serious. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. You're obviously struggling, sitting in a public library on a Saturday, wearing clothes that look like they came out of a dumpster. It's sad, Chloe. It really is. I always told you that your lack of ambition would ruin you. Several people at nearby tables turned to look. Chloe felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. Keep your voice down, she hissed. Why? Are you embarrassed? Derek chuckled. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and tossed it onto the small table next to her chair. Here, go buy a gym membership, or some decent food. You look terrible. Your face is all puffy. Chloe stared at the money on the table. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from a sudden, blinding rage. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to slap him across his perfectly shaved face. She wanted to scream that she was carrying a child. But before she could move, the atmosphere in the library changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift in the air pressure. A sudden, chilling drop in temperature. The quiet murmur of the library died completely. The librarian at the desk stopped typing. A student nearby lowered his headphones. Derek, oblivious to anything outside his own ego, kept talking. Honestly, I dodged a bullet. Imagine if I had married you. I'd be stuck with a lazy, fat. Finish that sentence. The voice was low. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. It cut through the air like a straight razor, vibrating with a quiet, lethal promise. Derek froze. He spun around, the sneer still half-formed on his face. Standing at the end of the aisle were 3 men. 2 of them were large, wearing dark, understated suits, their hands resting casually near their waistbands. But it was the man in the center who pulled all the oxygen from the room. Leo Costa. He wore a tailored black overcoat over a dark suit. His dark hair was neatly swept back, his jaw set like iron. His eyes, dark and bottomless, were locked onto Derek. He wasn't looking at Derek like he was a threat. He was looking at him like he was a stain on the floor that needed to be bleached. Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands flew to her stomach, a protective, instinctive gesture. No. How did he find me? Derek swallowed hard. His corporate bravado evaporated instantly. He didn't know who Leo was, but primal instinct was screaming at him that he was in the presence of an apex predator. Excuse me? Derek tried to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked slightly. This is a private conversation. Back off, pal. Leo didn't blink. He took a slow, measured step forward. His expensive shoes made absolutely no sound on the floor. You dropped some trash, Leo said, his voice dropping an octave. He gestured slightly with his chin toward the $100 bill sitting on Chloe's table. I was just making a donation, Derek stammered, taking a step back as Leo approached. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. Leo stepped past Derek, completely ignoring him now. He stopped 3 feet from Chloe. For a long moment, the silence was deafening. Leo's dark eyes swept over her. He took in her pale face, her tired eyes, and then his gaze dropped. He looked at her open coat. He looked at the undeniable swell of her stomach pressing against the thin fabric of her shirt. Chloe saw the exact second the realization hit him. The mask of cold indifference cracked. A muscle feathered in Leo's jaw. His hands, hanging at his sides, slowly clenched into fists. He looked back up at her face, his eyes burning with an emotion so intense it made Chloe want to look away. It was a mixture of profound relief, terrible anger, and something deeply, painfully vulnerable. "Leo," Chloe breathed out, barely a whisper. Leo slowly turned his head to look back at Derek. "You called her fat," Leo said. It wasn't a question. Derek looked wildly between Leo and Chloe, panic finally settling into his eyes. I was just joking. We used to date. It was a joke." Leo nodded slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a sudden movement. He just looked at one of the large men standing at the end of the aisle. "Break his jaw," Leo said casually. "Then take him outside." "What? Wait, you can't!" Derek screamed, but the large man was already moving with terrifying speed. Leo turned his back on Derek, blocking Chloe's view as a sickening crack echoed through the quiet library, followed by a muffled yelp. He stepped closer to Chloe, his broad shoulders shielding her from the violence. He reached out, his large, warm hand trembling ever so slightly, and gently cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "You ran from me," Leo murmured, his voice thick with raw emotion. He dropped his gaze to her stomach again, wonder replacing the anger in his eyes. "You ran from me, with my world inside you." The library returned to an eerie, forced silence. The muffled sounds of Derek being dragged through the emergency exit faded into the background hum of the ventilation system. Nobody screamed. Nobody called for security. The 2 massive men accompanying Leo projected a quiet, terrifying authority that glued the bystanders to their seats. Chloe stood frozen. Her hand was still pressed over the heavy swell of her stomach. Leo's touch lingered on her cheek, his skin warm and slightly rough against hers. "Get your coat," Leo said. It wasn't a request. The raw vulnerability that had flashed across his face a moment ago was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable mask. He stepped back, giving her space, but his dark eyes never left her face. He was assessing her, scanning for injuries, for signs of distress, for anything that indicated the child was in danger. "Leo, Chloe's voice betrayed her, trembling in the quiet air. "Not here," he interrupted her, his tone flat. He picked up her threadbare scarf from the table and held it out. "We are leaving." She wanted to argue. A part of her screamed to run, to slip past him and disappear into the labyrinth of bookshelves. But she was 6 months pregnant, exhausted, and carrying 30 extra pounds of baby weight. More importantly, she knew Leo. Running was what prey did. If she ran now, he would simply hunt her down, and the consequences would be far worse. She took the scarf, wrapping it around her neck. She picked up her worn handbag. Leo didn't touch her again, but he stayed close. Too close. He moved with a predatory grace, guiding her toward the glass exit doors without ever actually laying a hand on her. They stepped out into the biting November wind. A sleek, armored black SUV idled at the curb. One of the large men from the library was already standing by the open rear door. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the pavement, giving Chloe a wide berth, Leo gestured for her to get in. She climbed into the back, the leather seats cold through her cheap coat. The door shut with a heavy, vacuum-sealed thud, cutting off the noise of the city traffic. Leo slid into the seat beside her a second later. The driver pulled away from the curb immediately. The interior of the SUV was silent, smelling of expensive leather and sharp mint. The partition separating them from the front seats was raised. They were completely alone. Chloe stared out the tinted window. The grey city blocks blurred past. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her throat. She could feel Leo staring at her. She felt the weight of his gaze on her profile, on her throat, and, inevitably, on the rounded shape of her belly resting in her lap. 6 months, Leo finally said. His voice was a low rumble in the confined space. Chloe closed her eyes. Almost 7. A sharp exhale hissed through Leo's teeth. You left me in March. You knew. I found out 2 weeks after I left. And you stayed gone. The anger was there now, a dark, churning undercurrent. You lived in some freezing shoebox, wearing rags, letting vermin like that suit back there insult you while carrying my child. She snapped her head toward him. The exhaustion morphed into a sudden, defensive flare of anger. I kept him safe, Leo. I kept us both safe. Safe from what? Leo demanded, leaning closer. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. Safe from the money? Safe from the best doctors in the state? Safe from me? Safe from your world, she shot back. Safe from men who leave photos of my mother's house on a restaurant table to send you a message. Leo went completely still. The anger vanished, leaving a sudden, chilling void. The SUV hit a pothole, jostling them. The baby chose that exact moment to deliver a sharp, rolling kick against Chloe's ribs. She winced, pressing a hand to her side, catching her breath. Leo's eyes instantly dropped to her hand. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking. His hand moved toward her, hovering inches from where the baby had kicked. But he didn't make contact. He pulled it back, clenching it into a fist on his thigh. Tell me exactly what happened the day you left, he said quietly. Chloe turned back to the window. The fight drained out of her. I'll tell you when we stop moving. I'm tired, Leo. He didn't push. He sat back in his seat, staring straight ahead at the black partition. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was heavier. It was the silence of a man calculating exactly how much violence he was going to have to unleash. The SUV did not go to the luxury hotel downtown where they used to meet. It drove past the city limits, heading up into the steep, winding roads of the hills overlooking the skyline. They pulled into a long, gated driveway. Heavy iron gates swung open silently, revealing a massive, modern estate constructed of dark concrete, steel, and sweeping panels of reinforced glass. It looked less like a home and more like a high-tech bunker disguised as architecture. The car stopped beneath a severe concrete overhang. The doors opened. Chloe stepped out. The wind was harsher up here, biting through her thin maternity shirt. Before she could shiver, Leo draped his heavy wool overcoat over her shoulders. The coat swallowed her entirely. It smelled like him. Cedar, rain, and a faint hint of gunpowder. Inside, he ordered gently. He led her through massive double doors into a sprawling, open-concept living space. The floors were polished dark wood, the walls a stark gallery white. Minimalist furniture sat arranged perfectly around a massive stone fireplace. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the grey city below. It was beautiful. It was entirely sterile. A man in a sharp suit appeared from a side hallway. He was older, with greying temples and a sharp, hawkish nose. Mr. Costa, the man said smoothly, the perimeter is secured. I had the kitchen staff prepare a meal, as requested. "Thank you, Paul," Leo said, not looking at him. He guided Chloe toward a plush velvet sofa. "Sit down." Chloe sank into the cushions. The ache in her lower back throbbed in rhythm with her pulse. She let her head fall back against the velvet, closing her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, Leo was crouched in front of her. He had shed his suit jacket, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his white dress shirt. He rested his hands on the edge of the sofa cushion, near her hips. He looked up at her, his face stripped of the cold authority he wore for his men. "The restaurant," Leo prompted, his voice low. "The day you vanished." Chloe swallowed hard. "I was waiting for you. A man sat down at my table." She paused, forcing herself to look into his dark eyes. He had a jagged scar across the left side of his neck. It looked old. Burn tissue, maybe. Leo's hands tightened on the cushions. The knuckles turned white. He slid a photograph across the table. Chloe continued, her voice remarkably steady. "It was my mother's house in Ohio. He told me to tell you that your time was up. He said you had terrible taste in collateral." The silence in the room was absolute. Paul, standing by the hallway, seemed to stop breathing. Leo didn't explode. He didn't yell. He stood up slowly. His face was a mask of terrifying, utter calm. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and stared out at the city below. He stood there for a long time, his hands clasped behind his back. "Dominic," Leo said softly to the glass. Chloe frowned. "Who?" Leo turned to look at her. The emptiness in his eyes made her shiver, despite the heavy coat. "The man with the scar. His name is Dominic. He runs a rival faction on the east side. We had a disagreement over shipping routes 6 months ago." He walked back over to her. "You thought you were protecting me. I knew I was protecting my mother. And myself." Chloe rubbed her stomach instinctively. "And later, I was protecting the baby. I know how your world works, Leo. Families are leverage. He's not a chess piece. I won't let him be a target. He—" Leo's voice cracked slightly. Chloe looked down. "Yes, it's a boy." Leo closed his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath, dragging a hand through his dark hair. When he opened his eyes again, they were completely focused. The coldness was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning possessiveness that made the air in the room feel thin. He turned to Paul. "Call the lieutenants, all of them. Assemble them at the warehouse downtown." "Sir," Paul hesitated. "It's Saturday. The truce with the East Side." "There is no truce," Leo said. His voice was lethal. "Dominic threatened my family. He put a target on my son. Tell the men to gear up. We are taking the East Side tonight. Burn the shipping yards. Burn the safe houses. Find Dominic and bring him to me. Alive." Paul nodded sharply, pulling a phone from his pocket as he retreated down the hall. Chloe stared at Leo. The reality of what she had triggered crashed down on her. "Leo, you're starting a war." "No," Leo corrected, turning to look at her. "He started a war 6 months ago when he sat at your table. I'm just finishing it." He walked over to the sofa and crouched down again, bringing himself level with her. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and laid his palm flat against her swollen stomach. The heat of his hand seeped through her shirt. "You ran because you didn't trust me to keep you safe," Leo whispered, looking deep into her eyes. "You won't ever have to run again. By the time the sun comes up, there won't be a man left in this city stupid enough to look in your direction." The sheer scale of the bed was ridiculous. It was a massive king, piled high with down comforters and heavy linen sheets. Chloe lay near the edge, propped up on a fortress of pillows. Outside, The rain had turned into a sleet storm, the ice ticking lightly against the reinforced glass of the bedroom windows. It was past midnight. She was exhausted down to her marrow, but sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cold, terrifying certainty in Leo's face when he ordered the destruction of a rival faction. The bedroom door opened quietly. Leo stepped inside. He looked completely wrecked. His white dress shirt was untucked, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He smelled of cold air, exhaust fumes, and a sharp metallic scent that made Chloe's stomach clench. He didn't turn on the main lights, moving through the shadows cast by the small bedside lamp. He walked to the edge of the bed and stopped. He looked at her, his eyes hollow with fatigue. "Is it done?" Chloe asked, her voice barely a whisper. Leo slowly unbuttoned his cuffs. "Dominic won't be a problem anymore. His network is dismantled. The East Side belongs to us now." He said it so casually. The dismantling of an empire, the ending of lives, spoken with the same tone a man might use to discuss a home renovation. It was the reality of the man she loved, and it terrified her. He moved to the small armchair in the corner of the room, sinking into it. He rested his elbows on his knees, hanging his head. "I looked for you," he said quietly. The confession slipped out into the dark room. "Every day. I had men searching bus terminals, train stations. I tore through the bank records. Nothing. You vanished like a ghost. I paid in cash. I used a fake name." Chloe shifted, pulling the comforter tighter around her shoulders. "I had to." Leo raised his head. "You thought I would hurt you." "No," Chloe said firmly. "I never thought you would hurt me. I thought your enemies would. And I thought, if you found out about the baby, you would take him. You're a man who needs to control everything, Leo. I couldn't be a prisoner in a golden cage, raising a son who would grow up to wear a suit and order hits on other men." Leo stared at her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and raw. He stood up slowly and walked over to the bed. He didn't sit. He just stood over her, a massive shadow blocking the ambient light from the window. "Do you know what my father did to me when I was 10? Leo asked. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion. Chloe shook her head slowly. "He took me to the basement of a restaurant in Little Italy. There was a man tied to a chair. The man had stolen from the family." Leo's eyes were focused on the wall behind her, seeing ghosts. "My father handed me a baseball bat. He told me that mercy was a luxury we couldn't afford. He made me watch what he did to that man. He made me understand that fear is the only currency that matters." Leo looked down at her. "I spent my entire life building walls, building an empire out of fear, so no one could ever put me in a basement again. And then you walked into the hotel bar." He sank onto the edge of the mattress. The heavy springs groaned under his weight. He reached out, hesitating for a second, before resting his large hand on her stomach again. The baby shifted immediately, pressing back against the warmth of his palm. A sharp, ragged breath tore out of Leo's chest. He dropped his forehead against the mattress, resting his face near her hip. "You shattered every wall I had, Chloe," he whispered into the heavy blankets. "You left, and the silence in my life was deafening." Chloe reached out, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair. She felt the tension radiating off him in waves. He was a ruthless monster to the rest of the world, but here, kneeling beside the bed, he was just a terrified man. "He kicks the most when I'm tired," she murmured, stroking his hair. "I think he hates when I stop moving." Leo slowly raised his head. He looked at her belly, his eyes tracing the subtle movements under the blanket. "I won't let him be me," he said fiercely. The raw desperation in his voice broke her heart. I won't hand him a bat. I won't teach him fear. I swear to you, Chloe. Can you promise that? Chloe asked, her voice steady but sad. Can you really promise that this world won't touch him? Tonight, you burned down half the city for us. What happens in 10 years when someone else decides they want your territory? Does he go to school with bodyguards? Does he learn to check under his car before he drives? Leo's jaw tightened. I will handle the threats. You can't handle all of them. The only way to stop the threats is to step away. Leo looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the iron will in her tired eyes. She wasn't an accessory. She wasn't a mob wife willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for a black credit card. She was a mother, fighting for the soul of her child. You're asking me to walk away from the only life I know, Leo said slowly. I'm not asking you to do anything, Chloe replied. She pulled his hand closer, pressing it firmly against her stomach. Another sharp kick landed against his palm. I'm telling you that I am raising my son in the light. He is going to scrape his knees, playing in a public park. He is going to ride a yellow school bus. He is going to know peace. She met his gaze, her expression unyielding. You can come with us into the light, Leo, or you can stay in the dark, but you cannot drag us back down with you. Leo stared at the defiant woman sitting in his bed. He felt the tiny, persistent thumping of his son against his hand. He looked at the empire he had built outside the window, a kingdom built on violence, isolation, and paranoia. And then he looked back at the woman holding his heart in her hands. Okay, Leo whispered. The word sounded foreign on his tongue. Okay, you don't just resign from the Mafia. There is no 2 weeks' notice. There is no HR department to handle the off-boarding process. There is only blood, money, and leverage. For the next 2 months, the concrete fortress on the hill became a war room. Chloe stayed out of the meetings. She spent her days in a sunlit room on the south side of the estate, peeling away the sterile, gallery-white paint and replacing it with a soft, warm amber. She ordered heavily discounted cribs online, refusing to let Leo spend $10,000 on a custom mahogany bassinet. She assembled it herself, a screwdriver in one hand and a mug of herbal tea in the other, while the muffled sounds of heated arguments drifted up through the floorboards. Downstairs, Leo was tearing his own empire apart by the roots. He sat at the head of a massive slate dining table. Around him sat 4 lieutenants. Paul stood by the window, his face pinched, watching the winter snow bury the driveway. The ports go to the Rossi family, Leo said. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the center of the table. They've wanted the East Side docks for a decade. We hand over the leasing rights, clear and free. A heavily scarred man named Carmine leaned forward. You're giving away $50 million a year in transit fees. For what? Peace? For out? Leo didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The legitimate businesses, the sanitation contracts, the commercial real estate, the auto groups, stay with us. We restructure under a holding company. I remain a silent partner. Paul steps in as CEO. The illegal books, the gambling, the protection rackets, the shipping lines, you split among yourselves. But the Costa name is removed from all of it. The men stared at him. It was unprecedented. Bosses didn't step down. They died in prison, or they died in the street. They'll see it as weakness, Leo, Paul warned, turning from the window. The Rossis, the West Side crews. If they know you're disarming, they won't just take the ports. They'll come for the house. They'll come for you. Let them try. Leo leaned back in his chair. The cold, dead-eyed predator was back, a terrifying mask slipping perfectly over his features. I am handing them a golden goose. If they take the deal, they get rich. If they come for me, I will burn them alive in their beds. Make sure they understand the distinction." The men swallowed hard. They understood. Upstairs, Chloe dropped a screw. She grunted, resting her hands on her knees, staring at the tiny piece of metal on the floor. She was huge now, 8 months pregnant. Bending over was a logistical nightmare. A shadow fell over the doorway. Leo stood there. He had shed his suit jacket, his tie loosened. He looked at the half-assembled crib, then at the screw on the floor. He walked over, picked it up, and took the screwdriver from her hand. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, driving the screw into the wood with effortless precision. "I'm pregnant, Leo, not dying," Chloe replied. She sank into a plush rocking chair in the corner. "How are the negotiations?" "Messy." Leo checked the stability of the crib rail. "It's going to cost me 80% of my liquid assets to buy out the old guard and ensure the transition is permanent. The holding company will keep us comfortable, but the extravagant money, that's gone." He looked at her, searching her face for regret. He had offered her the world, and now he was stripping it down to a fraction of its size. Chloe just smiled. She looked around the amber room, at the cheap crib, at the stack of cotton onesies on the dresser. "Good," she said simply. "I never liked extravagant." Leo walked over and knelt beside the rocking chair. He rested his head against her knee, a heavy, exhausted weight. Chloe threaded her fingers through his dark hair. The tension in his neck was like coiled steel. "2 more weeks," Leo murmured into her jeans. "The paperwork clears. The crews separate. Then we're ghosts. Just another wealthy family in a quiet suburb." "Just another family," Chloe echoed. She rubbed her thumb over his temple. "No bodyguards at the grocery store. No bodyguards." He promised. And for the first time in his life, Leo Costa was terrified he wouldn't be able to keep one. The illusion of control always shatters eventually. For Leo, it shattered on a Tuesday in late January at 3 in the morning. Chloe woke up with a gasp. It wasn't a slow build. It wasn't a gentle tightening. It was a vicious, blinding cramp that seized her lower back and wrapped around her stomach like a vice. She gripped the edge of the mattress, a sharp cry tearing from her throat. Leo was awake instantly. The man slept like a soldier in a trench. In a fraction of a second, he was out of bed. The bedside lamp clicked on, his eyes scanning the room for a threat. "Chloe, it's time," she gasped, squeezing her eyes shut, as another wave of pain hit. My water broke. What followed was the complete dismantling of the city's most feared man. Leo didn't call his security detail. He didn't order a motorcade. He threw on a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt, grabbed the hospital bag sitting by the door, and practically carried Chloe down the stairs. They piled into a modest, unassuming Volvo SUV he had purchased a week prior. The first truly normal car he had driven in 15 years. The roads were slick with black ice. The city was asleep. Chloe gripped the handle above the passenger door, her knuckles white. "Breathe, Leo. You're gripping the steering wheel so hard it's going to snap." "I am breathing," he lied. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ground together. He ran 3 red lights, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror out of sheer, ingrained paranoia. They reached the hospital. No private entrance, no bribed doctors waiting in a VIP wing. They walked through the sliding glass doors of the public emergency room. The next 12 hours were a blur of fluorescent lights, the sterile smell of iodine, and the relentless, rhythmic beeping of fetal monitors. Leo sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed. He was entirely useless. This wasn't a rival gang. This wasn't a hostile negotiation. This was biology, brutal and indifferent, and he couldn't intimidate it into submission. Every time Chloe squeezed her eyes shut in pain, a muscle feathered in his jaw. He held her hand, letting her crush his fingers, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. "You're doing perfectly," the attending nurse, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, said as she checked the monitors. She glanced at Leo. "Dad, you look like you're going to pass out. Keep breathing." "I'm fine," Leo growled, his voice a low rasp. Chloe managed a weak laugh, which quickly morphed into a groan. "He's a control freak. He hates waiting." By 3 in the afternoon, the waiting was over. The room became a flurry of activity. Doctors, nurses, bright lights. The pain crested, overwhelming, drowning out everything else in the room. Chloe pushed until she felt blood vessels popping in her cheeks, until her vision spotted black. She felt Leo's hand behind her neck, anchoring her. "Look at me," Leo commanded gently, his voice cutting through the clinical noise. "Right here, Chloe. You've got this." One final, agonizing push, and then a sound. It was thin at first, a wet, sputtering cough, followed immediately by a furious, full-lunged wail. Chloe collapsed back against the pillows, gasping for air. The sheer rush of adrenaline and relief made the room spin. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, moving quickly. "Healthy lungs. 3:10. They cleaned him rapidly, swaddling him in a cheap, striped hospital blanket. The nurse turned and held the small bundle out. Not to Chloe, but to Leo. Leo froze. The man who had brokered millions, who had ended lives without a second thought, stared at the 5-pound infant as if it were an unexploded bomb. His hands, rough and calloused, trembled as he reached out. He took the baby. The silence in the room seemed to stretch. Leo pulled the bundle close to his chest. He looked down into a tiny, wrinkled face. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was still crying, a furious, red-faced protest against the cold air of the world. Leo slowly lowered his head. He pressed his lips to the boy's forehead. The crying hitched, then settled into a soft, disgruntled sniffling. Chloe watched them. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, tracking through the sweat on her face. She saw the exact moment the last of Leo Costa's walls crumbled to dust. His broad shoulders shook. A single tear slipped down his cheek, landing on the baby's blanket. He walked over to the bed and carefully, reverently, laid the child on Chloe's chest. "Meet your son," Leo whispered, his voice completely broken. Chloe wrapped her arms around the warm, squirming weight. She looked up at Leo. The dark emptiness that used to reside in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by something profound, something terrifyingly fragile. Love. "What are we naming him?" Leo asked, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed, trailing a finger over the baby's tiny, perfect hand. "Sam," Chloe said softly. It was a normal name, a quiet name, a name for a boy who would ride school buses and scrape his knees. "Samuel," Leo nodded. "Sam." He looked at the closed hospital door, then back to his family. "No more ghosts, Chloe. I promise." 2 years later, early May, the city park smelled heavily of damp earth, blooming cherry blossoms, and the sharp, greasy tang of a nearby hot dog cart. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of noise. Teenagers blasted music from portable speakers. Pigeons fought over discarded pretzel crusts. Children shrieked, their voices cutting through the mild spring air as they tore across the expansive, vibrant green lawns. Chloe sat on a weathered wooden bench. She held a large iced coffee, the condensation dampening her palms. She wore a simple, faded yellow sundress and battered canvas sneakers. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unstructured braid, a few stray pieces catching the breeze. She looked entirely unremarkable. That was the greatest victory of her life. The permanent, bruised shadows that used to live under her eyes were gone. The rigid, defensive posture she had carried for 3 years had melted away. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the ice rattling against the plastic, and let her gaze drift toward the edge of the playground. I said, "No, buddy. We don't eat the dirt. The dirt stays on the ground." The voice was a deep, gravelly baritone. It belonged in a smoke-filled back room, or echoing off the concrete walls of a warehouse. Hearing it gently negotiate with a toddler over soil consumption was a contrast Chloe would never get used to. Leo was sitting on the thick wooden border of the sandbox. He was dressed in faded, soft denim and a plain grey t-shirt that stretched tight across his chest and shoulders. His dark hair was a little longer now, losing the severe, military precision of his old life. Yet, he still looked dangerous. You couldn't erase the sheer, imposing mass of a man built like a heavyweight fighter. You couldn't entirely wipe away the quiet, lethal economy of his movements. He scanned the park every few minutes. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was just a lingering reflex, a ghost of a past life. Sitting in the sand between his heavy boots was Sam. 2 years old, wildly unsteady on his feet, and currently wearing denim overalls caked in a layer of grey dust. Sam giggled. He looked at his father, maintained unbroken, defiant eye contact, and deliberately raised a chubby fist full of wet sand toward his mouth. "Sam." Leo's tone dropped half an octave, a warning note. "Put it down." Sam shrieked with bright, ringing laughter and launched the handful of sand directly at Leo's chest. Leo closed his eyes for a brief second. He exhaled a long, measured breath, brushing the grit from his collar. He reached down with large, heavily calloused hands that had once dismantled a criminal syndicate overnight, and scooped the boy up under the armpits. Sam squealed, kicking his little legs as Leo hoisted him into the air, flipping him casually over a broad shoulder. "He is a menace to society," Leo declared, walking over to the bench. He deposited the squirming toddler onto the grass next to Chloe. "He has zero respect for authority. None." "He's exactly like you," Chloe pointed out. She leaned forward, pulling a wet wipe from the diaper bag at her feet, and began scrubbing at Sam's filthy hands. "Did you really expect a compliant child?" Leo grunted, sitting heavily on the bench beside her. The wood groaned in protest. "I expected him to not try and eat a rock." Chloe laughed. It was a full, clear sound. They sat together in the afternoon sun, a completely ordinary picture of domesticity. The transition hadn't been easy. The first year had been a nerve-shredding exercise in waiting for the other shoe to drop. You don't just resign from the Mafia. The silence of their new suburban home had felt deafening, heavy with the expectation of violence. But the violence never came. The holding company thrived under Paul's management. The old crews were too busy squabbling over the scraps of the east side to look for a ghost. Leo drove a dark blue station wagon that permanently smelled like crushed goldfish crackers. He went to the hardware store. He paid taxes. "Look who it is." The voice cut through the background noise of the park. It was grating, loud, dripping with a pathetic, desperate need to assert dominance. Chloe's hands stilled on Sam's wrists. The muscle memory of fear flared for a microsecond before her rational brain engaged. She turned her head. Walking down the paved path, about 20 feet away, was Derek. Time had not been kind to him. The polished, untouchable executive from the diner was gone. He looked deflated. His hairline had receded aggressively, and his shoulders carried a permanent, defeated slump. He wore a suit that looked slightly shiny at the elbows, carrying 2 cardboard drink carriers and a large, awkward tote bag strapped over his shoulder. He had stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring at Chloe. Derek blinked, trying to reconcile the woman on the bench with the memory he held. He remembered a bloated, exhausted girl hiding under an ugly thrift store coat. The woman sitting before him was radiant. She possessed a quiet, unshakable confidence. She looked expensive, not because of her clothes, but because of the profound peace settling in her eyes. Then, Derek's gaze shifted to the man sitting beside her. The recognition hit Derek with the force of a physical blow. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw, the jaw that had been shattered into 3 pieces, requiring 6 weeks of liquid diet and a surgeon's delicate touch, gave a violent, involuntary twitch. The paper cups in his hands began to rattle. Leo didn't stand up. He didn't square his shoulders. He simply turned his head and looked at Derek. The park was loud, filled with the sounds of 100 people living their lives, but a suffocating vacuum formed around the pavement where Derek stood. Leo's dark eyes were completely void of emotion. He didn't look at Derek like an enemy. He looked at him the way a man looks at an insect he might decide to crush or simply ignore. The absolute lack of effort in Leo's stare was far more terrifying than a drawn weapon. Derek took a stumbling step backward. His breath hitched audibly. He looked like he was about to vomit. "Derek, what are you doing? I need those files back at the office 10 minutes ago." A severe, older woman in a sharp pantsuit marched past him, glaring over her shoulder. She didn't stop walking. She didn't care about his sudden paralysis. "Coming, Mrs. Higgins," Derek choked out. His voice was a thin, reedy squeak. He didn't look back at Chloe. He dropped his gaze to the pavement, his shoulders hunched up by his ears, and practically scurried down the path, chasing after a boss who clearly despised him. He vanished into the crowd of weekend tourists, just another tired, broken man in a big city. Chloe watched the space where he had been standing. 2 years ago, Derek's words had the power to crush her. They could dictate her worth. Now she felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no vindication, just a mild, fleeting pity. "A friend of yours?" Leo asked. His voice was mild, but his hand slid across the back of the bench, resting possessively behind her shoulders. Chloe turned back to her husband. She looked at the man who had burned his entire empire to the ground, simply to guarantee her safety. She looked down at Sam, who had successfully found a cleaner, marginally more acceptable twig to chew on. She reached out, wrapping her hand around Leo's thick forearm. His skin was warm in the sun. "Just a ghost," Chloe smiled softly, leaning her weight against his side. "And we don't worry about ghosts anymore." Leo looked at the crowded park, at the open, unguarded space. He relaxed his grip on the bench, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He kissed the top of her head, grounding himself in the scent of her hair and the chaotic, beautiful noise of their new life. "No," Leo agreed, his voice rough with quiet awe. "We don't. Did Chloe and Leo's journey keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved seeing this fierce mother protect her child and watch a ruthless Mafia boss risk everything for love, hit that like button right now. We pour our hearts into bringing you deep, grounded stories with characters that feel intensely real. Don't miss out on our next thrilling romance. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with a friend who loves a good redemption arc, and drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment.